If this quiet history stirs you, please subscribe. Subscribe for more traces of Ice Age shores. Subscribe to drift back each night. If this gentle history soothes you, please subscribe. Before the deck lights, there was the glow of a thermos cap, the metal rim warm against chapped lips, the steam perfuming the air with bitter tea and a thread of citrus oil. She was a maritime archaeologist who preferred pencils to pens, graphite to ink because dampness blurred certainty. The neoprene clung to her like cold moss as she checked the tether to the remotely operated vehicle, listening to the muted whir of thrusters testing in the dark. In a plastic tray lay tiny zip-tied vials labelled in a tight hand: silt, shell, charcoal, fibre. Her gloves creaked softly when she flexed them, recalling the first time she swam over a drowned dune, feeling sand move like sleeping breath beneath her fins. A fisherman, older than the harbour's oldest timbers, had told her where to lower the camera. Under the lamplight, she smiled, then slipped the robot into black water that tasted faintly of iron, ready to read the flattened script of the seafloor. At the foundation of this long shoreline story are small, stubborn facts that set their own low music. In wind-polished caves overlooking ancient dunes, ochre fragments bear cross-hatched engravings, the groove depth measured in fractions of a nail width, their edges worn smooth by handling. Shell beads, drilled with care, show microscars under the microscope, a halo of polish where cord once slid and tightened, smelling faintly of chalk and salt when wetted again in the lab. Nearby, stone points with a lustrous sheen reveal heater treatment, the glassy fracture speaking of controlled fires hot enough to change stones in a structure. These are delicate tasks done by quiet hands, proving the possession of method and patience. What power grew from such work, if not identity recognized at a glance? The strength to bind wood and stone into longer reach, the ritual of colouring skin and objects to draw circles of belonging. The surf answered then, as now, with permanent, living noise. In that era, coastlines lay like open corridors between ebb and dune, offering miles of shell-rich flats, lagoon mouths and river fans. Add a net woven of plant fibre, twisted with practiced fingers, scented slightly of sap and smoke, and an inlet becomes a larder. Set stone weirs where water breathes in and out, and a family gains predictable protein. The stones warm under sun by day and slick with moonlight at night. Child hands learn to read tide underfoot the way later scholars read ink, feeling pressure change through soles and ankles, lifting baskets with grit under nails. Such work mattered because it tamed a rhythm without forcing it, harvesting the swing between brine and fresh with craft instead of conquest. As empires would later learn, nothing binds people like food shared, and nothing frees them like surpluses saved as smoked strips and dried roe perfuming the air. Civilization, if the word must come, begins with nets, fire, and a calendar traced by the moon. Centuries later, when writing on clay catalogued tribute and conquest inland, another kind of ledger lay at the coast, unwritten but durable. A knuckle-deep notch carved into driftwood, aligned with a certain ridge on a certain hill, a mound of shells glazed by rain and sun, marked where to set baskets as the first silver backs of fish pressed inward. Under the flint's edge, the fibres of plants sang softly as they separated, the rhythm shared by mentors whose stories drifted like smoke. This ledger carried instructions for survival, rituals for making individuals legible to others, and a sense of horizon measured not by distance but by taste. The shift from brackish to sweet, the sweetness telling you when to drink. When storms tore the markers, people rebuilt them, proving that the power here was adaptation repeated until it became a faith. Who wrote the coastline's script if not practiced hands, salt-lined eyes, and minds trained to listen for change? Alongshore travel, instead of high-risk marches inland, threaded communities together like beads on a cord, the cord itself braided from kelp and sinew, oiled so it would slide without squeal. Charring wood to lighten and harden it, they shaped small watercraft that echoed drift logs, paddles that entered quietly and left no splash that would spook fish or seals. A beach produces a catalogue: shell for beads, bone for needles, sinew for lashings, pitch for waterproof seams, dry grasses that catch and hold tinder with a toasted perfume. This was work that multiplied power subtly, extending reach across coves and inlets, allowing ideas to drift with people, as meals and songs do. Sharing a design for an efficient fishware made kin across long geographical arcs, and giving a charm threaded with certain shells carried meaning like a passport. Such exchange needed no palaces, it needed calm water, steady hands, and night fires blinking like low stars along the dark shore. The tide remembers, even when it erases. Stone remembers too, though it speaks through chips and shine rather than names and boasts. In that age, someone learned to heat stone carefully in buried pits, the pit edges smelling of damp earth and charcoal, the heat creeping in until fracture patterns changed from dull to crisp. After cooling, the flakes sang when struck, their edges thin enough to part hide with soft pressure rather than brute force. People combined these edges with wooden shafts and mastic made of plant resin and powdered red earth, a compound with the fragrance of pine and dust. In this there is an early chemistry, a merging of materials held together by technique repeated and taught, proving collective attention. The value created lay not in the artifact alone, but in the teaching line. The way a child's hand steadied under an elder's touch. The way songs timing the steps kept embers aligned with breath. The sand remembers in muted ripples. Instruments hum softly. The hollow waits, patient as moonlit water. Many generations later, tales of the city under the waves appeared in coastal myth, told in low voices beside windy fires where sparks leaped and vanished. The myth made hierarchies from the sea itself, imagining welled courtyards cut from living stone and staircases worn smooth by ritual feet, echoes bouncing in chambers smelling faintly of damp limestone. Yet as diving became possible and instruments improved, the camera's unblinking eye found patterns less grand and more intimate. Post holes in parallel, indicating fences or pens, cobble lines tracing fish traps, patches of burned sand that told of repeated fires. An underwater microphone picked up the ocean's tremor, and, between pulses, silence where voices might once have been. The collision of legend and measured evidence did not accuse the legend, it refined it. Instead of a drowned palace, we see a drowned neighborhood, its value born of chores repeated until they became liturgy, and its power expressed in meals secured against uncertainty, in warm hands and full bellies. Centuries after that, when coastal maps grew precise and land grants stretched to tidal flats, another silence formed, smelling mostly of paper, glue, and dust. Records of submerged features, entries in logbooks, and sketches of regular stones were often filed under fisheries or dismissed as natural, the ink fading while tides carried sand across memory. Some suppression came from misaligned incentives, declaring old structures meant regulation and scrutiny that owners did not desire. Some came from awe, wearing the mask of disinterest, a reverence that refused to meddle with the quiet below. In the archives, drawers stuck before sliding open with a sigh. A map's faint blue grid revealed dots a hand had added with patience, suggesting a knowledge kept to a small circle. The power in such suppression was control over narrative, and the cost was the fading of techniques that had fed families for generations. The surf broke outside, and the building's windows rattled like a distant drum. In the language of instruments, truth arrives as a pattern. A sonar returns sharper than surrounding chaos, a magnetometer twitch where iron should not be, a sub-bottom profiler drawing ghost lines beneath silt. The boat's hull creaked softly. Light blinked on screens in a dim cabin perfumed with coffee and engine oil. On one pass, a grid of pushers in the sand matched a known spacing for basket posts used in certain tidal ponds. On another, a U-shaped feature with a narrow throat suggested a weir designed to coax fish into a trap with the rising tide. These shapes, measured and mapped, added up to routine rather than spectacle, to to lives structured by calendars made of water and moon. That is, civilization writ small and stubborn, prearranged cooperation, shared skill, rituals at predictable intervals, power from predictability rather than force. We study it with humming devices now, but it was built by hands that moved to the rhythm of waves. By then, genetic evidence had begun to whisper alongside the stones, a song of population movements that smelled, faintly somehow, of smoke and earth, because lab machines run hot and gloves gather dust. It suggested threads of kinship along coasts, a braided pattern consistent with boat crossings sheltered by islands and beach ridges. A shell bead type clustered in one region appeared far away, carried perhaps as a gift or as a token of obligation that outlasted a voyage. Such threads imply a ledger of debts and favours, the kind of bookkeeping that keeps groups whole without written marks. A person who arrived with smoked fish, green seal fat, and stories could claim shelter in exchange, proving the worth of remembered routes and seasonal timing. The smell of dried seaweed and the creak of leather carried news as surely as any crier. The ghosts of maps in our blood align with the ghosts of fences and fires checked by machines. The tide holds its counsel. Through ages of low sea, this literal commonwealth persisted, adapting as wind patterns shifted and rivers braided new mouths. When the coast stepped back as if inhaling, salt marshes spread, their grasses rustling with insect song like rain on paper. Communities shifted their markers, retied their nets, and traced new lunar calendars with sticks poked into damp sand. Value mattered here in two directions. Inward, as families prospered on steady protein and craft work. Outward, as exchange bound distant groups into mutual care. Power never required walls. It required flexible attention and a willingness to share precisely timed knowledge. Reverence filtered through work. A chant softly sounded when the first run of fish arrived. Pigment daubed on cheeks when a boat returning heavy made a channel bright with scales. These rites washed away quickly in literal water, yet they trained minds to believe in cycles, in return, in the dignity of repetition. Who would not build faith on dependable tides? Still, accidents also wrote silence across this world. A storm pitched steeper than memory lifted anchors and scattered weir stones, the sea tasting of torn plants and ground shell, the air carrying the metallic tang of shredded flotsam. Fire, sometimes escaped from a pit, ran through dry grasses and charcoaled the posts meant for baskets. A disease, unrecorded by script, passed through a camp and counted its victims in hush rather than tallies. When hardship layered with a shift in the shoreline, families moved, shoulders bowed under baskets that smelled of smoked fish and hope, leaving only footprints that wind erased. The sea later advanced with its usual patience, filling footprints with foam and then with sand. We speak of suppression by law or politics, but accident is the most ordinary librarian of forgetting, stamping books with silence. The ocean's long exhalation covered the shelves and left only the faintest index visible to instruments and eyes that learned to see. Across a bay, millennia later, a monk with red-stained fingers copied a passage about floods and lost gardens by lamplight that perfumed the scriptorium with wax and faint animal glue. He added a margin note about fishermen who pointed at an old alignment under clear water, a line of stones they avoided out of respect. His superior frowned, suggesting that such matters drew minds from higher truths, and the note remained small, tucked like a sigh against the main text. Books moved through hands and shelves, pages were rebound, the margin shrank until the note almost vanished under a new leather seam. Yet when a later restorer lifted the binding, the little voice returned, telling of stones in water arranged by someone's intention. Reverence had silenced the observation, not through malice, but through piety misapplied, transforming a community technique into a whisper. The work mattered because it fed bodies that later fed minds. The copyist felt the gentle asymmetry, but let the wax cool. In that same chain of memory, A coastal steward under a distant crown kept records of nets and taxes in a brittle notebook flavoured faintly with salt from his damp sleeve. He knew of submerged traps but omitted them, suspecting that acknowledging them would invite claims he would have to enforce against neighbours who kept his boat repaired in winter. He heard the low, rattling laugh of old fishers when younger men mentioned the forgotten lines, and he understood that laughter as warning, a shoreline way to maintain commons knowledge by making it seem foolish to outsiders. Some silence is a fence made of humour, of stories shaped to keep strangers away from certain coves. The value in such an omission was local stability. The power was the ability to keep a shared resource intact. Centuries later, the ledger where he wrote mended nets and collected coin sits flat in a museum drawer, the salt gone, the smell of cardboard rising like a thin fog. At low tide, some evidence refuses burial, standing like ribs when water drains. A line of stakes, softened and blackened, protrudes from a bay floor, their tips coated with velvet weed that smears fingers green. A careful hand can press a fingertip into the soft, damp wood and feel fibres that once yielded to an adz's rhythm. Nearby, necrotic sand gives underfoot with a hollow sigh, the underlayer holding a lens of charcoal where fires burned, the grains coated in sheen like sugar. These features do not ask to be palatial. They ask to be recognised as intention. We made a wall here, a funnel there. We cooked many nights here. We kept a memory of procedure that outlasted a lifetime. The wealth was accumulated in the form of regular dinners and the power to predict hunger's end, stored as songs about when to set and lift and eat. The air tastes briny and gulls call like knives hung on a line. As empires rose inland with noise of bronze and later iron, their captains often dismissed the literal arts as peasant craft, beneath notice except as catch tallies. A general's journal, smelling of lamp soot and oiled leather, might list coastal villages in columns of tribute, yet it rarely records the weird placements that quietly ensured those figures. Suppression by disinterest is still suppression, and it shapes what later scholars consider civilization. Yet the very smoothness of inland roads was subsidized by the quiet abundance of coastcraft, as dried fish travelled far and lit fires in mountain towns. The power relationship inverted elegantly. While armies marched, the sea kept feeding their step. In that era, a person who could read the smell of the tide iodine sharpness on the edge of a storm, the sweet rot that promised shellfish, held knowledge as valuable as any cuneiform scribe. The sea wrote in salt, and the script endured. Centuries flowed, and a surveyor, standing on an exposed sandbar at dusk, peered through a level that sipped at the fading light, the metal cool against his brow. His assistant held a rod steadily, boots sinking with a hiss into wet sand that smelled like cold pennies. Between them stretched a sheet of water whose surface trembled under an offshore breeze, the ripples blurring margins that maps demanded to fix. As the line steadied, he noted an anomaly, a regularity of bumps beneath a shallow channel that refused to be random. Later, rubbing his eyes gritty with sand, he inked the bumps as dots on a margin, not daring to clutter the official map. That reluctance was self-preservation, not malice. Still, under the dots lay a shape that would, in another age, look like a fishweir, a knowledge architecture stubborn and plain. Ripples made a soft, stroking sound along the measure's legs, as if urging something said, something not yet safe to remark loudly. The wind carried it away. On a different shore, far away but joined by the long necklace of human drift, a potter's pit near an ancient dune held bits of fired clay with finger imprints smooth as river stones. The impressions showed hands accustomed to knotting cord, the ridges patterned like woven mats, suggesting that textiles, now vanished, organised daily life as thoroughly as stone. The pit still carried a faint char smell when excavated, a surprise to noses used to dust and faint mould. Plant fibres imprinted into clay hovered at the edge of sight, proving that perishable arts had a registry in the underworld of fragments. Clothes, nets, bags, slings. These multiply hands and time, letting a person carry more, trap more, move farther with less loss. The stability their efficiency builds is civilization's stealth. A society that stores summer's glare as woven goods and winter's patience as plaited rope holds power that neither gleams nor clangs. A breeze lifted grit, and eyes watered pleasantly from mineral air. In this chain of living and leaving, pigments play the role of both signal and memory. Red ochre, ground to a fine powder that smells like damp stone and metal, mixed with fat or plant binder, becomes a paste that clings to skin with a soft drag. Applied to wrists, cheeks, or objects, it leaves a mark that says "we," the simplest and strongest pronoun. The presence of pigment on shells and tools found near ancient shorelines suggests that ritual threaded through the practical, that beginning or ending a season involved colour, song, and a tactile assertion of identity. The value here is cohesion, an adhesive more durable than resin alone, giving people the power to recognise kin and obligations. When later waters rose and rinsed these sites, the pigment remained in pores of stone and shell, stubborn as memory. Under LED light in a clean room smelling of ethanol, the red glows dully, like banked embers at the end of a night's labour. Centuries later, romance novels and philosophers alike wrote about cities lost to flood, stones wreathed in kelp, and bells that toll underwater like dreams. Their words smelled of ink, tannins, and sometimes cheap perfume when the books came new, and of dust and attic dryness when they aged. Such tales planted search images that bent eyes toward grandeur, away from the littler shapes that endure. If one expects a temple, one will misread a pen, and so many divers passed over the true veins of civilization in their hunt for marble. Suppression by glamour is a form of forgetting, beautiful and effective. Yet gradually, the patience of small studies accumulated, revealing that elaborate simplicity stones placed at proper distances, baskets woven to precise diameters, fires tended to steady heat, was the architecture of thriving lives. The power in this recognition is the restoration of dignity, a righting of a scale. The sea tasted of salt then, as now, refusing to sweeten anyone's fantasies. In 1963, a coastal survey ship lobbed an unexpected echo in a shallow bay, a tight V-shaped return repeated across several transects, the paper chart curling as warm air met cooler hull. The captain sniffed the air and declared it nearly windless. The smell of fuel faint but present, and the operator poured coffee that tasted of tin and patience. A botanist on board, hitching a ride to reach marsh sites, peered and murmured that the returns matched a certain fish trap geometry she had seen in an old ethnographic drawing. The report, filed, sat at the bottom of a stack. A decade later, a storm scoured the bay floor, and the trap stones surfaced in neat, regular arcs. The rediscovery arrived not with trumpets but with gloved hands lifting stones that slicked palms. Power often hides in persistence, and the value here was the enduring utility of a design that made the sea do the work. The instruments hummed, and gulls cried like laughter on the wind. Back in the core lab, optically stimulated luminescence teased time from grains that tasted of nothing and smelled faintly of plastic trays and rubbed latex. Each sample, taken from beneath the drowned shore, told of the last moment sunlight touched those grains before burial, a clock hidden in sand. The numbers translated into phrases before many thrones, after many droughts, aligned with sea level curves traced from coral terraces. No need to count exact years beyond a handful. Better to feel epochs like breezes that warmed or chilled the shore. The laboratory's hum seemed, to the tired listener, like surf stripped of its liquid body, yet the results anchored dreams. Mapping these ages onto the underwater features suggested a coastline where people built and rebuilt, proving a sustained presence. The gift of the technique was not a single date, but the cadence of occupation. Soft light reflected off the clean bench top, and a technician breathed slowly, as if careful not to wake the sleeping sand. The instruments blinked, then settled. Even inland, rivers carry coastal stories. Their braided mouths, now drowned, once perfumed the air with tannins, mud and flour, even near their estuaries. LiDAR over deltas shows drowned levees, faint under meters of water, hints of raised ground where camps could rest above spring floods. Canoes, or simple floats, sealed with sticky resins, would have slid along reed walls that rustled like parchment, carrying food inland and returning with stone from quarries, bone from hunts, or gossip about who fished where. These upstream and downstream exchanges gave shape to obligation networks that knit people into larger wholes without needing to stand in ranks. The river's surface, slick and glassy at dawn, would carry voices, the timbre softened by fog. In this way, value travelled, and power spread without lording over anyone, shared under the maxim that tide and flood both return. When these channels later drowned, they left traces that, once seen, appear obvious, as if always waiting for the right angle of light. Across an ocean, on a different shelf, the same economies appear as different accents, tidal pools fingering basalt, seaweeds with different tastes, shellfish with unfamiliar heft. Yet the pattern repeats, reliable as the hush before a wave breaks. This does not diminish local genius, it amplifies it, showing how the environment and human skill weave together to make civilization scale by pattern rather than empire. Where hardwoods grew, paddles thinned toward edges and smelled of sweet sap. Where softwoods dominated, paddles broadened and satiny oils soaked in to prevent splitting. In places where certain barnacles attached and cut feet, woven sandals spread with velvety friction underfoot. Inlet to inlet, the precise recipes of pitch varied. The breath timing of heat matched to local resins. The power this created was diversity overlapping with continuity. A tapestry that worked because errors could be corrected locally without issuing decrees. The sea taught this lesson and kept repeating it with every tide. Suppression sometimes came with force, not merely neglect. When raids from inland threatened, communities along the shore unbuilt their obvious structures, scattering stones and hiding posts under silt, the work quick and efficient, the sound more shuffle than crash. Better to disappear a trap than gift it to an enemy. Fire again played its role. A pen burned rather than captured. Memory moved into people and banished itself from the ground out of caution. Generations later, those structures remained absent, and without survivors to point the way, archaeologists could only hypothesize from scattered clues. This is where breath and patience matter, where a brushed chalk smear on a rock that shouldn't have been there means more than a fortress would. Power becomes the ability to vanish without losing technique, value stored in minds and hands curated by elders. The smell of wet ashes from a controlled burn lingers in soil grains, and devices can still taste it when people cannot. Silence protected them. Rediscovery often arrives through craftspeople rather than scholars. A basket maker, tracing a pattern inherited through unbroken lineage, recognizes a rhythm in the spacing of posts shown on a diver's tablet. "We build fences like that under the moon," she says, touching the screen with fingers that smell of willow bark and river. Her observation collapses time, connecting living practice to drowned geometry. Suddenly, a shape in mud becomes a sentence, and scholars listen to the voice that never stopped speaking. The value of this bridge is humility that increases accuracy, and the power is a restoration of rightful authorship. Not everything lost is gone. Some of it is simply living elsewhere, in hands that never abandoned the task. As instruments draw maps, gently buzzing and glowing, a human voice with the vocabulary of practice can name what lines truly mean. The tide runs, and the hoop of willow creaks as it bends, a sound like a door reopening. The story steps through. Sometimes, reverence stops the shovel before spade meets earth. A coastal community, guarding a cove that provided safe harvest for generations, prefers not to expose ancestral work to tourism's bright eyes and noisy boats. They offer access to data, to patterns and measures, but ask that the stones remain water dark and quiet, smelling only of sea. In this choice, there is power that refuses spectacle and insists on living relation over extracted finds. The archaeologist understands, recognizing that the work's purpose was always nourishment and cohesion, not display. A compromise forms, images shown with coordinates removed, techniques described without sacred details. Suppression here is not erasure but stewardship expressed as discretion. Value accrues to trust. For the outside listener, the hush may feel like denial. For those within, it tastes like bread shared across seasons. Machines idle softly and the surf speaks louder. The patience of waves becomes the model for publishing. Not everything needs to be loud to be real. Later, a student in a city far from any coast reads an index of shell bead distributions laid over bathymetry, and the pattern resolves into a necklace of exchange that once clung to the world's wet edges. She eats lunch at her desk, rice cooling, tea cooling faster, and draws a line across shelves that were once dry, her pencil whispering. The beads have different hues, not that any colour is permanent underwater, but the distribution carries a logic that smell and taste could once confirm. The lemony bite of certain seaweeds near one region, the coppery note of marsh water in another. With this map, she proposes a pilot radio of sorts, where subtle tastes and textures linked to memory gave reliable directions without fixed stars. The value is simple. More households fed for more days, fewer crises flaring into die-offs. The power is cumulative and quiet. The desk lamp warms her hand, and a draft from the window stirs her notes like leaves. When storms hit a bay whose bottom holds walls, turbulence sings differently. An engineer, listening with a hydrophone, hears the song settle into a slightly lower register as water drags across aligned stones rather than random silt. This is not romantic, it is measurable. A spectrogram blooms, coloured bands sliding and settling. The engineer's computer smells faintly of ozone and dust, and her chair squeaks as she leans in. If we can hear a wall, can we reconstruct the rooms it suggested? The lanes between traps? The lanes between tasks that organised people's steps? Questions posed this way do not ask for palaces, they ask for daily order. Embedded in the song is the rhythm of to and fro, of walking to a pen in time with the tide, of the creak of a basket handle under a hand turned calloused, strong and steady. The answer is not entirely in the spectrogram, it is in the memory of how water and stone converse. The room smelled faintly of salt and warm plastic. Humans name by habit, and to say civilization is to invite images of columns and scripts. Yet if civilization means a system that turns knowledge into security, then these water-edge networks deserve the word. The job of a weir keeper mattered because it transformed uncertainty into manageable risk, and the ritual of setting and lifting at proper moons created a clock that gave power to families across lean seasons. The night air carried songs, not to entertain only, but to coordinate. The same phrase rising, the same phrase falling, aligning many hands like gears softly meshing. When people paint shells or their own faces in sequence, they are writing, just not in strokes preserved on sidewalks. The sea is poor at keeping paper, it is excellent at keeping patterns in the collective mind. What would an empire at the tideline profit to demand monuments, when the only monument that lasts here is technique, and the only bronze is the burnish on a well-used tool? The sand remembers. Instruments hum. The hollow waits. Silence also arrived as an accident of attention. Scholars focused inland for reasons that smelled of book glue and stone dust, of large grants and classical languages. The literal arts seemed too wet, too messy, too perishable, as if only ruined stones deserved respect. Meanwhile, on the seafloor, baskets softened, wood turned to shadow in mud, and posts dissolved into a sugar of cellulose that fed invisible lives. Rediscovery therefore required new tools, and those tools, even when precise, needed new metaphors. A sub-bottom profile looks like layers of cake disturbed, then re-smoothed. It takes a chef's sense to know where someone sliced and where the batter simply swirled. The gift of turning this knowledge into bedtime narrative is to let the perishable return, in words, as something you can taste again: salt, smoke, the crisp end of a dried fish. The power to narrate becomes a restoration, stitched from evidence and restraint. The lamp's shade glows with warm light. Breath steadies. Across a different sea, a diver pushing through clouded water feels fingers brush across a row of pebbles arranged too evenly to be storm-thrown. Silt puffs like breath in cold air, the cloud tasting chalky. He moves away, waits, returns, and the line persists. He follows it to a curve that suggests a throat, to a widening pool, to posts sunk and rotted smooth. He surfaces, spits, and laughs in the damp, describing the feel of it to friends on a boat smelling of diesel and fish scales. Later, a scientist listens, not discounting the sensation of touch as evidence. Rediscovery is often tactile first, cerebral second. The value of trusting hands is accuracy. The power is a partnership between embodied knowledge and measured calm. When the diver that night scrubs his hands with rough soap that smells like citrus, he keeps feeling the line under his skin. He calls it a voice that speaks through grain. The boat rocks softly at anchor. Suppression returned in a more modern costume when salvage and development needed clean narratives to support projects. Declaring a bay floor, naturally chaotic, simplified permits. Acknowledging underwater heritage invited constraints that investors found inconvenient. Reports softened observations into generalities, the language carrying the back-scent of bureaucracy, neutral, denatured, a little antiseptic. Yet storms continued their audit, revealing order again and again, strokes of stone under dull light that looked like writing in an alphabet we were trying to forget. Some young staffers, unable to sleep for the compromise, leaked images, not to inflame, but to invite precision. The leak carried the perfume of printer toner and paper warmed by a hidden desk lamp. The result was a new survey, and the pattern returned fresh, as if it had waited patiently while we played the old game of convenience. Value shifted toward protection. Power moved back toward place. On the mud, crabs went on with their own long history, unbothered by our papers. Centuries after the first hands tied the first clever loop, technology shifted again. Satellites read the world's skin, and computers subtracted tides and waves to reveal the land beneath the ocean's pulsing veil. What emerged were plains, ridges, and river mouths that once flared into fans, now drowned in green and blue. The maps smelled of new ink and ozone, and a trace of hot plastic from the plotter. The feelings they stirred smelled older, grass warmed by sun, the dryness of dune, the mold of shaded caves. Over these maps, one can draw paths where people could have walked without getting feet wet for weeks, thousands of breaths along shorelines now swallowed. In those spaces, the techniques we discuss would have multiplied, connecting, trading, arguing, loving. Civilization's full mixture of noise and warmth. The value in this view is context. The power is a rearranged humility. The present coast is a moment, not the truth. The tide knocks lightly at the map's edge. Rediscovery through songs and stories continued too. A lullaby, carried across generations, mentions stones that catch fish by moon's bite. A phrase dismissed as metaphor by modern minds. A linguist, soaked in tea and charts smelling faintly of fennel, heard in the cadence a set of instructions. Place stones at intervals that match a certain stepping pattern. Tighten the throat when the moon is thin. She walked with elders at low tide, and they nodded without speaking much, letting her count with her body. In the cadence was information that we could test, a code hidden in music. The value in carrying technique as song is resilience under stress. Learning never looked like study. Power expressed as melody is hard to confiscate. It returns when lips part. On bare flats where the sea pulled back, the mud reflected sky like a tarnished mirror, and footsteps printed and filled and printed again. We forget to listen in this way. The cove did not forget to answer. Some discoveries reached across boundaries between species. Observers documented the way certain shorebirds moved along weir lines, pecking at trapped fry, their calls sharp like pebbles clicked together. Seals learned to wait near throats where fish ran confused, their whiskers twitching in briny air. Humans learned from both, adjusting timing to avoid conflict, setting decoys to shift attention. The ambient soundscape, gull calls, wave hiss, reed rattles, seal snorts, became the metronome of work. This is the fecundity of civilization beyond walls, a negotiated truce with other lives. The value is shared abundance. The power is predictive harmony that reduces waste. When the sea rose, the birds moved, the fish found new channels, and people followed, carrying memory like a softly glowing ember cupped in hands. The smoke from dried grass fires curled with a sweet burnt smell that made eyes sting. That sting is part of the archive too, stored in nerves and remembered in words that try to smell. Discovery again found suppression when colonial authorities mistrusted local knowledge, deeming stone alignments superstitious while cataloguing imported bricks as proper heritage. In coastal villages, elders stopped pointing out features, tasting the metal of fear on their tongues when uniformed men walked the shore. For a generation, knowledge retreated indoors, into closed rooms where stories ran like water between cupped hands, shared only with those who could be trusted. Meanwhile, storms, uninterested in authority, uncurled mud and showed stones. Eventually, a new listener arrived, patient and respectful, offering to record without taking, to publish without naming. The balance shifted, the air losing its sour smell of suspicion and regaining the sea's clean cut. The value of respecting knowledge is accuracy, and the power is reconciliation with place. Civilization's core is the protocol that lets a group continue. If that protocol includes quiet, we learn to speak softly. A kettle on the table sighed, the tide outside sighed louder. Agreement formed like silt settling. Evidence of perishable ritual, too, flowered in unlikely contexts. In a peat lens beneath the drowned edge of an old marsh, beads strung with plant fibre persisted where one expected nothing but dark, sweet rot perfuming the shore. Under magnification, fragments of binder clung, a glossy residue that reminded technicians of honey, but smelled only faintly of old water. Beads clustered around a small bundle of charcoal and bone shards, perhaps a boundary ritual performed when a family moved camp. Ritual matters because it locates us in the model of the world we hold. It says here is first, here is last, here is between. The power here flows from continuity, the promise that moves survive, because meaning survives beneath the practical. The peat felt cool and sticky on the glove. Mud sighed as it was lifted aside. The ripple of a breeze made grasses hiss, and a bird called twice, as if answering and confirming the work's time. Threads almost invisible hold fast. Centuries passed again, and a collecting museum sought to display mysteries of the drowned. The exhibit designers loved light effects, ripples projected on floors that made visitors sway. Yet when the artifacts were chosen, so few stones, so many reconstructions, curators learned a hard truth gently. The most honest displays here are records of emptiness, well framed by careful words. The show smelled of paint and carpet glue and, faintly, seawater from a tank where live eelgrass waved. A quiet caption did more than a loud video. This alignment matched living weirs used until recently by near-coastal communities. Structures have not survived, knowledge has. The value of such framing is fidelity. The power is the refusal to replace missing stones with loud speculation. Visitors left quieter, tuning their imaginations toward daily life rather than grandeur. Their shoes squeaked softly on the floor. A child lifted a replica basket and felt its weight, and his face set in attention, the first tool of learning. Under a stony overhang near an ancient shoreline, soot clung to the ceiling in a faint, sweet smell of old fires. On the floor, bits of plant bedding lay compressed and then receded into darkness where damp ruled. Between the two, a clear zone told of sweeping, a neatness that signals intention and care. In this room, a toolkit waited in the mind's reconstruction, digging stick, hammerstone, scraper, awl, cordage, each with the texture of repeated handling rubbed into their surfaces. The ritual of cleaning before resting is civilization's grammar. A clean hearth burns better. A clear threshold keeps snakes out. Such acts grow power through minimal friction, saving sense of energy until they amount to aristocracies of time. Stepping into such a space, one hears the hush of a shelter that truly sheltered, the soft rasp of fibre bundled, the low murmur of planning. The air tasted of rock and ash. Underfoot, the sand gave like slow breath. The day exhaled. The big question keeps returning like a tide. What do we mean by civilization? When the record is broken, drowned, shredded, and yet the patterns are clear. The answer hides in labour profiles, in calendars and cooperation, in storages that smell of cured fish rather than incense. In that age, uncounted nights ago, people managed risk through community practice, turning the moon into a metronome and shorelines into record books written in baskets and stones. The value was security earned through precise repetitions. The power was mobility that did not abandon roots, but braided paths between them. If the word civilization requires writing, then let us read textiles and tides as that writing, their strokes tactile rather than visual. If the word implies urban scale, let us accept coastline scale, knitting coves into quilts that covered continents when the sea stood far away. Our own breathing aligns with waves without trying. Perhaps that is the oldest proof we have. A boat, centuries later, nosed above a shelf where the current's cool hand met warmer surface water. The captain closed his eyes, smelled the change, the ocean's clean blade thickening with a hint of river tea, and called to adjust course. He was not reading an instrument, though one hummed. He was reading a world written on his skin. On the screen, a faint geometry rose, lanes between lumps, a narrowing that felt deliberate. The crew, quiet out of habit rather than rule, leaned in as the light tapped their faces. If a knowledge practice makes bodies sensitive to subtle shifts, it has built a civilization within flesh. Over time, such sensitivity becomes embodied memory, passed through gestures more than words. The value is speed of response when a storm turns. The power is calm when every cue aligns. The bow dipped, a kettle rattled. The smell of steel and salt merged into that bracing perfume that makes lungs feel new. The captain smiled, then corrected lightly. We tend to think of suppression as an act by authorities, but time performs it with professional grace. Wood swells, dries, cracks, feeds fungus, fibres dissolve and feed the shore, bones soften and go floral in marsh acid. Against that, what survives? Stone, charcoal, pigments in pores, the wrappers of meaning rather than meaning itself. Hence the need for careful inference, a soft speech that matches the evidence's texture. A pierced shell can be a bead, it can also be damage, but an array of them, worn, polished and clustered with residues of fat and pigment, sings with the force of chorus rather than solo. Rediscovery is a patient assembling of such voices into a song that does not overclaim. The lab air smells of ethanol and clean rubber. The bench creaks. A small brush lifts a grain of red that will soon prove to be old skin's decoration. The proof knocks quietly, but it knocks. We learn to open at a hush. Leaning into that hush, we can outline a year in the forgotten civilization. In spring, when river waters sweetened estuaries and the taste shifted from briny knife to gentle sap, traps were cleared and repaired, the smell of wet wood rising as posts seated deeper. Ritual joined repair, a smear of ochre under the left eye, a chant naming the moons. In summer's warmth, nets dried on racks, the fibres tightening with the smell of warm plant oils, hands moving with the efficiency of long-learned patterns. In fall, smokehouses perfumed the camp, thin plumes like threads weaving into clouds as fish carne dried into leather soft strips. Winter saw tools mended, fibres twisted, songs extended with new verses that recorded small changes, births and losses. The value came as granaries of protein, as trade trips that returned with stone and stories. The power acted through confidence that tomorrow would, with work, resemble today in its safety. How else could children sleep, listening to surf? Each gesture placing a stone, whittling a peg, drilling a shell bead until the soft squeal turned smooth-wove community. The hands smelled of resin and smoke, the skin roughened just enough to map tasks like a ledger written on fingers. By crafting, they encoded belonging, the way certain knots tied in certain orders acted like signatures that needed no script. These knots could be recognized across a bay, the fragrance of their fibers distinct to a region, their patterns announcing identity without shout. Rituals bound maintenance to meaning. A child, given a bead at a first catch, tasting its chalk with pride. An elder, touching the bead and speaking names. The power of this slow archive is that it persists across generations even when specific materials perish. When the sea rose and moved the shore, the archive walked with the people. Even if stones drowned, the knots remained in hands. The night held that truth in the softness of its warm dark. Modern labs allow us to count the grooves in a drill hole and measure the angles of fracture in flint flakes, yet the truest measure might be sound. When a file made from stone touches bone, it sings a faint, rasping note, like dry leaves rubbed together. When pigments are ground, the pestil's pressure produces a low, silky crunch, distinct from sand. A net, wet and heavy, slaps the rack with a music that returns in dreams. These sounds, repeated, become timepieces in memory, their cadence aligning tasks to the body's clock. Instruments translate them into graphs, living ears translate them into routine. The value of listening is timing. The power is a choreography that keeps motions aligned without a conductor. At night, the sea's noise filled gaps, a blanket of white hush against which a single baby's cry could pierce and be answered. That harmony is worth calling civilization if the word is allowed to stretch and breathe. When civil codes arrived with drums and banners, they often made records of property, not practice. This is reasonable in one sense. Stones map to taxation more easily than tides. But the mismatch eroded memory. Over time, the formal register's silences became the default story, as if craft formed in water were inherently lesser. Rediscovery therefore also means rereading old codes with different eyes, hearing the lack as information. A grant outlining a bay and excluding tidal works reveals a policy rather than the coast's truth. A map that avoids submerged structures signals not an absence but a choice. Controversy, sometimes, tasted bitter in meetings, the air perfumed with stale coffee and heated electronics. Yet progress came when people agreed that any claim must match measured patterns, not wishes. The value of consensus built on evidence is durability. The power is legitimacy that survives storms. The sea respects none of our papers. Only our craft survives its attention. We learn, slowly, to write accordingly. From above, a shelf at low tide looks like hammered metal, dimples and ridges catching sun. From below, it feels like a roof with ribs, the current pushing and easing, a pressure massage. People learned both views, teaching children where to step by feel. The slick of certain algae warned of falls, the velvety drag of others promised firm footings. Taste, too, served as measure, the water's edge mineral flavors shifting with unseen sources, reading like a diary written in brine. These senses formed a suite of instruments carried in bodies. In our age, new instruments read deeper, their beeps and hums matching old cues. The value is in alignment. When a device confirms a grandmother's advice, trust grows. The power of paired perception is redundancy, resilience. A gull's wing flashed silver, a kid pointed and laughed. Underwater, fish moved like soft darts through a labyrinth built by forgotten engineers whose blueprint lay in tide's arithmetic. The blueprint still works if one learns to see. Within the archives of submerged landscapes, not all signs are utilitarian. A row of stones placed on a dune crest, with no trapping function, may have traced a line of meaning, the kind that tastes of reverence and quiet. Perhaps a procession walked there at certain moons, carrying baskets, singing to the water, requesting and giving thanks. Rituals align behavior and memory. Their power is social glue, and their value is predictability of cooperation. When water later covered the path, the stones, heavier than the dune's sands, remained. Divers brush them with fingers and feel the warmth held in stone, even in cold water, an illusion from myth and muscles. They call it a spine because it makes them stand straighter in their suits, a human reflex to meaning. Whether or not we can prove the right, we can recognize the human need to connect action to larger cycles. The smell of kelp waves in the mind. The song continues, soft and steady. Rediscovery intersects with technology in beautiful ways. In a darkened room, a researcher runs acoustic data through a model that turns echoes into images, contour lines into shimmering relief. The screen goes from grey to story. She sees a pattern, breathes out, and her breath fogs the glass of a mug that smells of cinnamon and heat. She writes calmly, refusing to claim what she cannot confirm, and sends the draft to coastal elders who add, remove, and polish words until the text fits lived memory. This collaborative work builds power without bluster, words that match world that informs words, cycling until trust arrives. Some sentences feel like stepping stones at low tide, firm yet wet, slick but reliable. The document's tone is lullaby rather than fanfare, respecting a subject that survived by being small in a loud world. When the piece publishes, readers feel soothed rather than excited, the right mood to absorb endurance. Outside, evening arrives like folded cloth. The first person to heat stone to make better edges did so for many reasons at once. The crackle of heated pebbles under sand sang of curiosity. The sweeter bitter scent of resin mixing with red powder told of experiment and then tradition. Each new edge made work smaller, tasks more precise, and because of that, lives more predictable. The ritual that anchored such technical steps could be as simple as washing hands in cold water that brightened fingernails and steadied mind, or as complex as singing a 4-part intergenerational call and response that placed the work inside a story. Power flows from the known, and known grows from repetition that fits the body's arc. We call that civilization because it creates time that is not clenched and fearful. Looking at these drowned traces, we recover the outlines of such days and nights. The air around the work table smells of graphite and paper, the modern equivalents of stone and cord. Memory enjoys such sympathetic scents. Sometimes, an accident of geology preserves an almost impossible delicacy. A footprint pressed into fine mud, later baked and sheltered, the toes' curls fixed, the arches shallow, tender, hollow. To see it makes breath catch, the body recognizing itself across 10,000 storms. A series of such prints near a drowned shore suggested a child dancing or darting, the pattern playful, not productive in any way a ledger would like. Civilization includes this, time for joy, room for quickness, that leaves no harvest but makes hearts lighter. If one wants an index of health, look for traces of play. The mud's smell, when the cast was lifted, was sweet like old wine, a memory of decay turned useful. The cast, in the lab, changed the rune's weight. Words quieted. We talk about fish and tools, but the dancer survived too, the one who ate well enough to dance. That is value turned to power without measurement. The tide went out, then returned. Instruments can mislead, and humility is part of any honest reconstruction. A grid seen on sonar may be a geological pattern, a line of stones may be storm-thrown. We guard against the romance of pattern recognition with tests and counter-tests that smell of acetone, ethanol, and sometimes burned dust as circuit boards warm. Yet when multiple lines converge, artifact-aware patterns, chemistry of residues, alignment with tides, and living memory, the case gains weight. It never becomes absolute. The sea dislikes absolutism. This built-in uncertainty creates a civilized habit in us. We learn to hold stories gently, to honor them without squeezing them into shapes they resist. The value is sustained inquiry. The power is in building a culture of attention that will not be swayed by loudness alone. In that, we match the ancient craftsperson. Try, adjust, share, repeat. The lab's clock ticks with a soft, old sound. Coffee cools. A gull's cry threads the air even here, inland, through a window. Consider the ledger of rolls in a literal camp. A tide reader adjusts schedules. A net amender counts coils. A firekeeper tends the sweet smoky braid that catches embers and nurses them through damp night. A storyteller binds these tasks with words that preserve technique. The sentences tasting of salt and oil because hands are never quite clean. An apprentice shoulder aches from lifting wet baskets. An elder's knees click when bending, and still she squats with grace. Over time, the ledger becomes tradition, and the tasks become identity. The rituals mark transitions into and out of roles. The glue here is trust, and the power is speed without chaos when a shout comes. Soft, because loud sounds spook fish, moves a line. None of this requires bricks. All of this builds a human world where tomorrow is likely to be good. If that isn't civilization, the word has simply narrowed too much, ignoring the strongest architecture we ever raised, cooperation. Centuries later, with many shores drowned, a librarian finds an old folio tucked behind miscatalogued volumes, the paper tasting slightly of alum and the ink faded to tawny brown. In the margins, a meticulous hand drew fish penned in fish shapes, the notes explaining that those who live by the edge build stones thus. The folio had been ignored because it lacked bold titles. She breathes in and smells a tang like walnut and anise, a ghost of the scribe's ink. She scans the page, sends it to a researcher, and the rediscovery begins again, now through the heaviness of the scanning machine, the low hum pulling her into a calm state. Suppression yields to chance and to a person who cares enough to look behind. The value of such moments is not the glamour of the find, it is the increase in precision they allow. The power is continuity. The sea outside the window is far away, but its breath, somehow, reaches the stacks. On the seafloor, structures live differently. Crabs move into voids once used by posts, their shells scraping with a tick that sounds almost like a clock under amplified water. Eels twine through throats designed to confuse fish. Seaweeds take root where baskets once stood. This second life complicates readings, patterns blur, new geometry layers over old. Archaeologists respect this living archive, knowing that to learn without harming requires tact. In some surveys, lights are dimmed to avoid stressing creatures. In others, the window is closed to breeding times. This ethic is civilization within civilization, the modern community practicing restraint in returning to the ancient one. The value is consent and care. The power is knowledge that can claim to be friendship rather than theft. The water tastes metallic still. Instruments blink quietly. The story we tell thus remains one of connection, not conquest. That flavor sits clean on the tongue. Slow, patient work reshapes what we call finding. We hear about the drowned, not as ruins, but as routines. And this is the point. The forgotten civilization of 97,000 winters was not an empire. It was the shore's way of making people into a structure that lives in the cycle of fish and moon. Its monuments were lines of stones warmed by sun for kettles. Its palaces were dry patches under rock where a family could sleep listening to waves. Its libraries were songs and knots. It mattered because it transformed hunger into recipes, risk into schedules, strangers into kin by exchange and by ritual touches of pigment. Holes in the record do not erase the structure any more than fog erases the landscape it covers. They ask us to breathe slower, to let patterns assemble. Under soft light, you can almost see the fences through closed eyes, the posts dark against brighter water. You can almost hear the soft slap of net and the low conversation in night air warming around a fire. Rediscovery will continue and keep changing shape. New instruments will taste older compounds, perhaps reading the faint citrus of plant resins or the herbal smoke trapped in the pores of stones, telling us who stood where and what they held. New collaborations will bind scholars to makers whose fingers remember knots, melted from male lines into female, from aunties to nieces, from uncles to nephews, through a chain unbroken by drowned ground. The speed and volume of modern news threaten patience, yet the sea insists that the true scale is slow. Power shifts toward those who can wait. The value accrues to those who can say enough, and mean it at the proper time, pulling traps before the last fish, teaching restraint as a creed that smells like seaweed and smoke. The lights dim in labs and on decks. The breath grows longer. In that easing, the old forms come forward, no longer forgotten, just noticed in the right stillness. Later still, a classroom, far inland, studies fish weirs as math. The angle of the V relative to current speed tells of optimization, a concept that tastes of chalk and coffee. Students draw graphs and then, invited to the coast, they feel the cold slap of water against shins, hear the sound change as the tide turns, and their faces alter as abstraction becomes wet and alive. Calculation meets craft, both improve. Civilization grows whenever such bridges are built, pulling children across disciplines the way an old weir pulled fish on silver arcs. The value is in the way knowledge broadens without flattening. The power is the dignity it grants both ancestors and descendants. They eat simple bread and dried fruit on a damp rock, and the food tastes better because the lesson is now somewhere between head and feet. Later, they sleep hard, dreaming of stones that hum when the moon reaches a certain slice. The sea keeps teaching this geometry. Among the last fires we can read in cores. A sudden thickening of charcoal streaks suggests a prolonged dry period, the air then tasting of smoke for weeks, the horizon tinted brown. Responding, a community might shift to deeper traps, to night fishing when cooler water held more oxygen, to divers slipping silently with baskets like dark moons underwater. Rituals changed too, loosening to adapt, then retying when rains returned with the smell of wetted dust, sweet as relief. Across such cycles, thought deepened around the core concept: do not take more than the water gives, return stones correctly, sing because songs carry schedules that ensure fairness. Power thus flowed along the low ground of caution and into the high ground of confidence. These are not rights a coin can buy, they are habits a family accrues. And when the sea advanced, as it always does, the skill set moved to new shores, leaving only lines in mud to betray its shape. The core sits, silent and dense with unsaid days. In the present, the diver who first felt the weir line beneath the silt takes her child by the hand at low tide, the child's toes chilled on the damp, firm sand. She points at a faint curve revealed for an hour and says not ruin, but tool, not temple, but kitchen, aligning the words with purpose. The child tastes the air, salty and clean, and asks the one rhetorical question that belongs everywhere: can we come back? The answer is yes, in our bodies and minds, and the way we tell this. The power of returning is what keeps any civilization alive, no matter how deep the water runs. The light is golden, the ripple sounds like silk pulled over wood. They stand together, breathing in tide's pace, learning again the old arithmetic: stones, water, moon, hands. The child squints, and the weir becomes suddenly obvious, then vanishes as a cloud crosses. Learning has this texture, prickling like salt on skin, cooling as it dries. Ritual coda rests here. The forgotten civilization did not forget itself. We forgot the scale at which its greatness lived. It exists where waves polish memory to a soft sheen and customs yield quietly to conditions, where power is a song everyone knows and no one needs to own. Its tools smell of resin and brine. Its archives taste of salt and ash. Its light comes from moon and flame rather than from marble. As you breathe in and hold a moment, you can feel how that long shore traces your own ribcage, a curve built on cycles. Perhaps the sea took the stones, but the design remained in ways of being that still nourish. We stand at water's edge and hear what we can, then we let the rest whisper, patient and present, promising that in the next low tide, more will show, then slide away again, inviting us to return and remember without insisting on ending the mystery.